Hey guys, welcome back to Clownfish TV. This is Neon. I am not here with Geeky Sparkles in this video, but we're going to talk about video games. We're going to talk about AAA gaming and what looks to be a kill shot for AAA gaming. Things are not going well. I mean, that's to put it mildly. We did a video on the gaming channel yesterday talking about the layoffs at Sony, and now there are layoffs at EA, and there have been layoffs at numerous other AAA studios. A lot of them have been shut down completely. A lot of indie games are kind of filling the void for where AAA titles would have been. They're actually outperforming AAA titles. Now you've got games like Helldivers 2 and Palworld and so many others, Lethal Company, selling more copies than like the Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, which was hundreds of millions of dollars. And even if these games perform well, even if they wind up, being a commercial success, you look at the overhead, and a lot of times they're not. In fact, this article from Polygon talks about the financials, and it's actually pretty well written. I will give Polygon credit where credit is due. It's pretty well written. And they are talking about, the expense of making AAA titles, and are AAA titles even viable anymore because of how long it takes to make them. And it is a roll of the dice as to whether or not they're going to be successful. And even if you have a game that is supposedly successful, like Spider-Man 2, it still might be a huge failure on paper. So we're going to talk about this. Before we get into it any further, please subscribe for more pop culture, news, views, and rants, guys. It's interesting this comes out the day that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out, which it looks amazing, by the way. But remember, it's been like, 4 or 5 years since the first part? And how many years after they announced a remake until we actually got the first part? And how many years is it going to be until they actually finish the game? Because remaking Final Fantasy VII by today's standards takes a very, very long time and lots of money. But this one's probably going to do okay. I'm thinking it is. I mean, Final Fantasy VII is the most bankable installment of Final Fantasy. But, are people going to wait like freaking 10 years to play the whole game? Because that's, I think, what we're looking at right now. I'm not sure where Rebirth ends. I haven't played it yet, but I can almost guarantee it's not the whole game. I'm sure there are probably at least 1 or 2 more yet. But yeah, Polygon has this up. Games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth aren't sustainable, and the Sony layoffs prove it. So yeah, they said Sony's PlayStation business announced plans to lay off 900 people, or 8% of its workforce, despite strong sales of PS5 and record revenue during its last quarter. Included in the cuts are layoffs at 3 of Sony's most successful studios, Naughty Dog, Insomniac, and Guerrilla Games. And there's no direct connection between these two events, but beyond the fact that Sony will have partly bankrolled Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in order to secure its exclusivity to PS5, Rebirth is still developed and published by Square Enix, which has yet to announce layoffs. On the scale of Sony, Microsoft, or Epic, or any of the dozens of other video game companies caught up in an industry-wide crisis. Look, the video game industry is top heavy. Like, it was more sustainable back in the day when you had relatively small teams of people working on games. Even Final Fantasy VII, the original Final Fantasy VII, was a massive undertaking for Square. And it had hundreds of people involved in it. But it was nothing compared to a modern AAA title. Like, I mean, most of the games I played as a kid probably had a staff of like 12 people working on them, or maybe 20 people. Pretty small staffs working on 8-bit, 16-bit, even 32-bit games. And now we've got these massive, AAA titles ballooning up to $200-300 million to produce, and like hundreds of people involved, and 5 to 10 years of development. Look at Suicide Squad. Was it like 10 years of development and $200 or $300 million, and it landed with a thud? Palworld outsold it. Lethal Company outsold it. Helldivers 2 looks like it's going to outsell it. Hell, Arkham, the Arkham games, was it Arkham Knight, I think, outsold it. And you could just wipe your ass with that money. So do you take another chance on something like that? Do you say, hey, we're going to commit another 10 or 15 years to some new game that may or may not do well. And we're going to commit hundreds of millions of dollars and literally stake our studio's livelihood on this game? Or do you say, well, you know what? Let's just pare back and do smaller games. I don't know. If it were me, I'm like, man, how many good indie titles could you have made with the resources that were poured into and squandered on something like Suicide Squad? So the Polygon article goes on to say that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is emblematic of a kind of game that the industry has leaned on particularly heavily over the past decade or so, particularly in the console gaming space. And the Sony layoffs are another sign that this breed of AAA mega game is no longer sustainable. Budgets have swollen, the big publishers' tolerance for risk has lowered, and that's resulted in them pushing all of their chips onto supposedly safe bets. Yeah, it's just what I was saying. Big games and the biggest franchises stuffed with features and homogenized in design in an attempt to get them to appeal to the broadest possible audience. Rebirth is a particularly striking example of the modern AAA game because it has such a clearly split personality. On one hand, it's a quirky, characterful, and dramatic RPG with propulsive narrative driven by nostalgia for the original game. Yeah, they could take chances back then. They could. It leans hard into fan service and has a very specific, very Final Fantasy flavor. Good. On the other hand, it pads out its enormous running time with many generic design elements. Open world exploration, side quests, collectible card games. Yeah, but those were always in more recent Final Fantasy games. That seem to have little to do with the core identity and that push it closer to other big mainstream success such as The Witcher 3 or The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I think they're forgetting that Final Fantasy VII was the Breath of the Wild of 1997, 1998. Like Final Fantasy 7 and 8 were huge. 7 more than 8. And I personally, I prefer 8. I'm going to tell, and I know I'm a heretic and I know I'm going to get so much shit for saying that, but story-wise, I prefer Final Fantasy VIII over 7. 7's original translation was not that good, and the story was confusing as hell. Plus, I like the more realistic characters in 8, and it reminded me of like a shonen anime, kind of. I think that one would actually translate well to an anime, but anyway. Yeah, they're just talking about how expensive these games have become. You read down through it, and they're talking about Spider-Man 2 costing $315 million to develop with an expected return on investment of 35%. So his predecessor, the Miles Morales game, had a return on investment of 122%. So that's the thing. People don't understand. You can be profitable. And this is why Disney shut down Disney Infinity, as I understand it. You can be profitable, but not profitable enough. Like, you can look at a situation and be like, we could plow $300 million into this and we might make a $40 or $50 million profit, or we can take that $300 million and double or triple it on something else. And that's what is going on. I think they're like, well, these AAA titles are a pretty dicey prospect. So then you have to ask yourself, why get all excited about the next generation of consoles? Because if the next generation of games are going to be smaller affairs, if we're going to have games that like everybody can run on a potato PC, and those are the games that people are playing. Kids are playing Among Us. They're playing Lethal Company. They're still playing Minecraft. They're not the ones that are buying these AAA titles. I don't think you're going to have many 10-year-olds buying Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. They don't care. Spider-Man they'll buy because it's Spider-Man. But, kids aren't going to play Suicide Squad. They're going to play Fortnite, though. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, as a developer, as a studio, I'd look at it and be like, yeah, we can dump a ton of money into something like this, or we can make a bunch of smaller games on a smaller scale that might actually have more mass appeal, and we don't have to charge as much for those games either. So more people are going to buy them. We can keep them at $20, $30. So at that point, do you need an Xbox 5000? Do you need a PlayStation 6? Because if you're not going to max out the capabilities of those consoles, what's the point? And I think that's what they're kind of looking at. I think this is an existential crisis. They actually talk about in this article. It's a bigger existential threat to AAA games than their cost. It's the time it takes to make them. 5 years at minimum, increasingly much longer. Rocksteady saw a 9-year gap between Batman, Arkham Knight, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Which must have made the latter's underperformance more galling. Yeah, you put all this time into a game. I mean, Grand Theft Auto 6, there's talk now that everybody's complaining they have to go back to the office to work on that. But I'm like, how many years between Grand Theft Auto 5 and 6? And are people going to care? What if the game sucks? What if you spend 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars and the game sucks? It lands with a thud and people go back and play the old game anyway. There's a very real possibility that could happen. It said Sony studio layoffs clearly target its overinvestment in virtual reality. They targeted its core AAA production studios because, to paraphrase COO and President Hiroki Totoki, is that who it is? Hiroki Totoki, who will take over from Jim Ryan in April. Those studios are making games too slowly and too expensively. Totoki noted that PlayStation was facing an entire calendar and financial year without any major releases from its first-party studios, which would have a negative impact on software and hardware. Yeah, I mean, think back to the PS1 and PS2 days. The games were made a lot faster. You would have, in any given calendar year, you would have tons of exclusive games, and many of them were good, and many of them would have been AAA titles, in their respective years. They would have been, top shelf games, God of War or, whatever, was coming out then. And, Kingdom Hearts or whatever, but it's not the case now. It is like years between major releases. Like, I'm looking at the PlayStation 5, which I have zero interest in buying. My kids each have one, but they play mostly PS4 games on it, But it's like, okay, so you had Horizon and you had Spider-Man and you've got Final Fantasy games for a little while, exclusive for a little while. But I'm like, then what? It's not enough. Like, back in the day, all those titles would have come out in one calendar year. That would have been 1 year. And there probably would have been twice as many quote unquote AAA titles in that one calendar year. It's not enough. It's not good enough. Yeah, look at this. In terms of pure God, I'm actually agreeing with Polygon. Look at this. In terms of pure calculation, they're right. The games are just too big. Something has to give. Every recent breakout success in gaming, from Baldur's Gate 3 to Palworld, and including Helldivers 2, was made by a modest team of around 100 people. Gaming has been mid-sized. It's mid-sized production driving toward a very specific idea which has the potential to find a broader audience, rather than a $200 million plus behemoth aimed at being all things to all players. Thank you. I mean, I think you'll still get games like that, but the reason they're remaking Final Fantasy VII, again, it's the most popular Final Fantasy game. If you're going to remake a Final Fantasy game with AAA values, a classic game, that's the one to do because it is the most bankable. But again, they have to split it up into multiple parts, and it's going to be spread out over the course of like 10 years. By the time it's all said and done, it's going to be like 10 years. Here's another round of layoffs. EA, 670 jobs. They cut a Star Wars game. Neil Druckmann may not have many AAA games left in him. He has very few left in him. So yeah, he's probably like, how many more of these games? I mean, if these games take 5 to 10 years to make, and Druckmann's like 45 now, he might only have like another game or two in him before it's time to retire, He say mulls over what the end game is when it's time to quit. He caps it off noting they thought about many more of these games. He has left noting that it may not be many. Druckmann's got the next entry in The Last of Us somewhere in the early stages, but outside of that, Naughty Dog's library is up for debate, and his involvement in future projects may put that into question. Yeah, I mean, what are you supposed to do? But meanwhile, apparently Avalanche is hiring for a new high-profile AAA title, so go figure, because Harry Potter did very well. I can almost guarantee you they're going to do a follow-up where you have to pay tuition at Hogwarts every month. That's probably what they're going to do. But even then, I'm like, are they going to go all in on it, or is it going to be a more modest, mid-sized AA game? Because again, I think you can get more mileage out of that. You can have more cross-platform functionality if the games aren't as graphic intensive And I think it probably is just a smarter way to go, but you know, it kind of invalidates the need for an Xbox follow-up or a PlayStation console follow-up, doesn't it? If everybody's playing mid-sized games that you can run on a laptop or on a mobile device, why do you have to buy another console? So the PC master race is going to win again. You know, I'm just saying. And Nintendo. It's always going to be like gaming PC and Nintendo, because Nintendo just kind of does their own thing. But there we go, guys. AAA Gaming is collapsing. Going to wrap it up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, and we'll talk later.